Right, the brushes you're going to be using are going to be very similar to this. A bit better looking, I hope, to start with anyway. So there's the 1-inch normal painting brush that you can get from very cheaply from your local hardware store. They're very robust. They'll take a lot of damage. They're quite soft, and in fact they're very good for a lot of techniques. There'll be what's called a filbert, which is a flat brush with rounded corners. That's very good when you're painting along edges. There's no chance of any errant hairs sticking out the sides. So that is in fact quite a popular brush for a lot of uses. Then there's the more standard flat brush. So it's got a flat top. Also very useful. So there's not really a lot of difference between those two. But if you can get a filbert, or if you have a filbert, that's probably a little bit better. Then of course for fine detail you have a range of small pointed brushes. Obviously depending on the amount of detail that you want to do, then it can be bigger or smaller. So this is a very fine one for fine hairs and detail around eyes, etc. So that's like a starting kit of brushes that you could be using. And I'll demonstrate how you can actually use brushes and the various techniques. For painting portraits, all you really need, an absolute necessity, is these 4 paints, which constitute the Zorn Palette, after an artist called Zorn who developed this palette. And what we have is yellow ochre, a kind of mustard ochre, a mustard yellow, black, a bright red. There's a whole variety of reds. It's important to have a bright red. A fire engine or Chinese red is the best. And of course white. It's also very important to use titanium white, because titanium white actually is very opaque and does good coverage. Other whites, such as zinc white, they tend to be transparent, so you can more easily see the underlying colours. So that's the range of colours we'll be using throughout this workshop. From time to time you might want a small amount of other colours, such as a blue, for things like eyes, and possibly a brighter yellow. But you can get away without these colours in most cases. Obviously, if you want to paint landscapes, then you'd use a totally different palette. You'd use a variety of greens and browns. And in fact, the more greens you have for a landscape, the better, because there's such a variety of greens in a landscape. So for portraiture, we just need these few colours. Now this is essentially a demonstration of how to use your brushes. So I'll put a small amount of paint down on this board, some yellow ochre, and a bit of black, to start with, and we'll just see how we can use these paintbrushes. Now, I keep on advocating that you paint very, very thinly, and that's because of the espresso technique. Because we're painting a lot of the painting in one session, we're getting to a situation where we've probably achieved at least 90% of the painting, so everything is going to be wet. So we'll be applying layers of paint on top of other layers. So it's essential that you start off thin, otherwise you're going to end up with a great big puddle of paint. So when I mean thin, I've got a small amount of black on this brush. I really do mean dig that paint in. There should be no kind of surface to the paint. You're really spreading it in. And in fact, this big 1-inch brush is really perfect for this, because it'll take a lot of damage. They are robust. You can really scrape that paint in. And you can see that I've got very little paint left on this brush now, and I'm still spreading it out. So when I'm talking about thin, I'm talking about this kind of thin. Using the brush itself, you can use it in many different ways. Typically, using paintbrushes, you straight backwards and forwards like this. And this produces the smoothest result. It doesn't damage the brush. And if you're painting a house, you'd be painting like this. Notice the way my hand is moving. I'm moving my wrist to get that effect. So that's the traditional way of using a paintbrush. So that's using the flat surface of the brush in this case. But of course you can also use the edge. So I'm using the thin edge, and that will give you a thinner line. You can also use the flat. Lay it flat and move it around like this. Now this will tend to, it's not good for the brush, but you can spread the paint over a wide area doing this, and I don't mind a little bit of damage to these big 1-inch brushes because they are so robust and they're so cheap. So there's different ways to use the brush, and I tend to use all these methods. So that's the 1-inch brush. You can do exactly the same with the other brushes. You can use the traditional flat surface. You can use the edge. I wouldn't do the total flat surface like with the 1-inch brush, because it does tend to damage the brush, and these smaller brushes are much more expensive, relatively expensive. So you could be spreading the paint like so. You can use the edge to make lines. Quite fine lines. So quite often I would be doing the initial layout of an eye using the edge of the brush like so, before moving down to a very small brush. So straight away you can see we now have 2 layers of paint. So this is another reason why explains why we need to be painting thinly. And whilst I'm here, just notice that you can actually mix the paint on the board. You don't necessarily have to be mixing paint on your palette, but you can actually do paint mixing on the board, and I very often do that because the effects you get are often very good for skin, as will become clear as we progress through this course. So we've immediately got 2 layers there. So if I now introduce another colour in the Zorn palette, the white, and we can take a dab of white, and we can do, using the edge of the brush, we can do some lines. We can mix that white, a small amount of white, directly on the board, and we modify the colour underneath it, so it's not white anymore, it's just a paler version of what was underneath. So this is how you might do some blending, and blending is only really possible, or it's much easier, when you have thin amounts of paint. Talking about methods of applying the paint, I use my index finger a hell of a lot, because you can really get a very smooth blend using that. Now if the paint was too thick, I couldn't blend it like that. So that's why I keep on stressing use very thin paint. So that's the filbert. The flat is very similar, but it's probably a bit more useful for using the edge, because you tend to be able to get a finer line, I feel. So once again, use the flat, use the edge, and obviously these come in different sizes, so the coverage will depend on the size of the brush. Also notice I'm not using terps, I'm not diluting this paint down, I'm using the paint straight from the tube. I'm mixing the paint without any liquid additive. There's no medium here. I'm mixing the paint straight from the tube. And all this works very, very well with these MDF boards. So see how a fine edge I can get with that brush. Finally, in the later stages of your painting, you'll be using a very fine brush. So if you want to draw hairs, if you want to to some very fine detail. And with this brush you can use the side, you can use the tip for fine lines, you can rotate it, and I often use rotation. So let's introduce the final Zorn colour. The bright red. So I can get some pure red colour, and as it mixes with the black it becomes brown, and you can delicately blend it in. Notice how I'm supporting my hand with my little finger. If you're not supporting your hand in some fashion, it becomes more difficult to control what you're doing. So you can use whatever method you can think of to control your positioning of the paint. Whilst I'm here, another feature of the Zorn palette, which helps you to extend the range of colours, is the fact that the white and black gives you the closest thing you're going to get to a blue. And as you can see, this grey, I hope you can see this grey is a bluish grey, and for example the whites of the eyes tend to be bluish. And then of course you can just use blobs of colour. So at the very end of your painting, when you're not particularly interested in the need to have thin paint anymore, you can then start using thick paint if you so desire. If the technique that you like involves thick paint, then you can start layering the paint on. But certainly in the early stages you need to be applying thin paint, and you can use your finger to blend things out to get all kinds of effects. Now if I try to, there's a thick amount of paint here, if I try to blend that, it becomes much more difficult to do any blending with thick paint. So what I've tried to cover in this short video is the brushes, the fact that you can do many things to the brushes. You can also, for example, do stippling. So if you want some kind of texture, I mean that texture there looks like crocodile skin or something. So you can do little short strokes. So there's a whole variety of things you can do with your brushes. The same goes with all the other brushes. You can do little dots, little squiggles, and in fact, when I do skin, I very frequently do little squiggles, because if you look at skin, it consists of a whole bunch of little pores and blemishes and little squiggles and little patches of paint are going to make your skin a whole lot better. Now, if you've gone over the top the way I've done, you can once again use your finger and you can move that around and just change the complete appearance and change the complete color and knock back highlights that have got too intense. At the end of the day, if you don't like the way things are going, you can get a rag and you say, oh, I don't like any of this stuff, and you can remove a hell of a lot of paint. Now, you can't do any of this using acrylics. These are techniques simply for oil painting. So it's a double-edged sword. Oil paint takes longer to dry, but when you're working, you can do so much more than you can with acrylics. And when we're talking about longer to dry, that really, once again, depends on the thickness of the paint that you've applied. Thick paint will take longer to dry, because basically all the oil has to evaporate off. Now, the way I paint, with thin paints and thin layers, I can, in most cases, I can carry on working the next day. If you're using very thick paints, the traditional way probably of using oil paints, you have to wait possibly for a week or more before you continue painting. But with my technique, you can very rapidly continue painting. Having said that, the paints actually dry at a different rate. So you may find the next day that some of the paint areas are totally dry. Black tends to dry very quickly, and other paints are still wet. But certainly within 48 hours, I would say, with my technique, all the paint should be dry and you can continue working. So to get back to the purpose of this little video, I primarily wanted to show you that you've got a whole bunch of tools. Your brushes, different brushes are used for different things. The 1-inch brush, very cheap, very robust. You can buy it from your local hardware store, and very, very, very useful. Here we are, a bit more paint on the area. And you should always use the biggest brush that will allow you to do the job you want to do. Obviously, I couldn't use this big brush to do the detail on this eye, but I could, at the preliminary stage of the drawing, I could do 2 eye sockets, because in this technique you start off with big shapes and then you move down to small shapes. So this could be the beginnings of where some eyes are going to be, and this could be the beginnings of a highlight on a forehead. So I'm using this big brush, where I can use the big brush, I'm using the big brush. For the smaller work, I'll be using a smaller brush, and I would progressively move from brush to brush. So I only use the very smallest brush when it's absolutely necessary, when I cannot do anything else, when I cannot use any other brush. Also, if you've got a limited range of brushes and you've got a dirty brush, you can remove a lot of it with a rag. Sometimes you get too much paint on the job, on the brush. You can remove. And the other thing is, I say I don't use terps, but the only time I do use terps is for cleaning brushes. So you may find in the progress of your painting that you need to, if you haven't got sufficient brushes, you may need to clean a brush. Make sure you dry it up properly before you continue painting, because we don't want it to be soaking wet with terps. Okay, I think I've said all I want to say in this. Notice how I'm just using rough dabs of paint, pure paint, and then blending it in. And if there's too much paint, get a rag, remove it. So it's very difficult to totally destroy a painting in oil painting, because everything is totally fixable. So you should experiment. Now the kit comes with 2 boards, so you could be experimenting away like this, and then you can rub all that away. And it doesn't matter if you can't get it perfectly clean, because all this paint is going to disappear underneath whatever you're going to be painting. And it just actually provides an additional layer of protection for the work surface. Thanks for watching.